Well, in an attempt to essentially get Brexit done, the Tories have essentially neglected a massive swath of UK businesses who are going to suffer. Businesses who will not thrive being not being part of the EU and being left out of the cold. The strategies and even defences that there were in place so that other European countries and other places could have access to their services, because that is what we are. We are a service-based economy, and having access to these things, if there is, the second you put in barriers, you then start have to follow laws. So this whole thing of, oh, we're going to, yes, we want to be trade partners with you, but we're not going to follow any of your rules, and then they don't say where they're going to diverge. Bizarrely, the government would be in a far better place if it actually laid out what its negotiating position would actually be. Because for all this nonsense that we've had for all these 4 years, the government has not laid out a coherent negotiating strategy. The EU has been very clear since day one. Either A, you follow our rules and you stick to regulatory alignment with us, or you don't. That has been their playbook, and they are the larger market. And in this case, larger markets always have their say, and they always get their say, because if not, the UK doesn't get access. It's as simple as that. And it's going to be the same in the US negotiations. So this whole idea, this whole bravado that Boris Johnson has been putting forward, we covered this last week. It's all for show. This is not aimed at a UK audience. There was a thing yesterday of a Brexiteer coming out and saying that the European Union doesn't understand that it's not negotiating with Theresa May's government anymore. That doesn't change. Just because Boris is now in control, it doesn't change a thing. But we've been saying this since the very beginning. This idea that the UK is this somehow like secret superpower that's been shackled by the EU is just a complete and utter myth. And it's made up by the Brexiteers, who it feeds into this nostalgic imperial fantasy. And we've gone over that enough times. But today we're going to cover something else. We're actually going to cover IP, or intellectual property, because this is something that is going to be left out in the Brexit negotiations and is going to affect hundreds, if not thousands, of British businesses throughout this country. So, the Tory mantra of Get Brexit Done has come at the expense of many UK business sectors and for those in the intellectual property industries. The outlook is bleaker than most. Intellectual property isn't talked about in the same way as the automobile industry or fishing or financial services, but it remains crucial to the UK. It covers research, development, creative outputs, and more. Theresa May's original withdrawal plan hinted at decent protections for these industries, but all that was left by the wayside when she was toppled, and it is unclear whether the government will revisit these areas in the upcoming negotiations with the EU. Now, negotiations have started, and what Boris Johnson wants to try and do is he wants to try and essentially sweep Brexit under the rug. Just because he's passed the withdrawal agreement and, again, tries to, quote, get us out by the end of the year, basically wants to portray as Brexit being done and over. That's not the case at all. What he wants, and again we've discussed this in the past, Boris Johnson wants to try and get all this huge massive deal done in essentially itty bitty parts, so that it appears on the surface like it's done. But in reality, it couldn't be further from the truth. And this is one of the areas that's going to suffer. So, in truth, it probably won't have the time. Boris Johnson's delusion to rule out any extension of the transition period means IP, which has already been largely ignored, is unlikely to get much attention at all. In its most recent cabinet reshuffle, the government decided once again to switch its minister responsibilities for IP, offering the role to Amanda Swalsey. The corrupt, but she's a Tory, she probably is. The current parliamentary Undersecretary of State at the Development for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It's the 6th time this role has changed hands since 2016. Tories not being able to keep a minister in place. Well, it could be worse. At least she's not the housing minister that's had just as many different ministers since the Tories came to power in the original coalition government. So, at the beginning of December 2016, Baroness Lucy Neville Rofield held the ministerial IP responsibilities. She had worked in the area for more than 2 years and was perhaps the least continuity Conservative candidate to hold the role. She was well respected in the IP world and has interest in industrial strategy and enthusiasm for the moving parts of the industry. But by the end of December, May's government had removed her from this role and shifted IP responsibilities into the portfolio for the Minister of Universities, Science, Research and Innovation, then held by Joe Johnson. Johnson didn't instill much hope. He seemed to put his focus on attention on the university's proportion on his role, despite persistent nagging from an industry that faced more uncertainty than most. He moved on from the role after less than a year and was replaced by Sam Gimal. He was in that place for less than a year. He had very little impact and quit in protest at May's Brexit deal, which, for what it was worth, held the very provisions for IP that had been requested by those in the industry. After the Gimal came Chris Skidmore, who had some positivity in the role and some genuine interest in IP proportion at the industry events. Skidmore seemed to be engaged and expressed an interest in wanting to do better than his predecessors. But after a few months, the game of musical chairs started again, with Skidmore being replaced by Joe Johnson, who held the role for another 2 months before resigning over the new Conservative leader Boris Johnson's Brexit strategy. Skidmore was then reappointed to the role and is now again being axed, this time from the cabinet entirely. Having just been confirmed as the new IP minister, Swaley has yet shown off her plans for the role. The only hint has been a letter written to the CEO of the UK Intellectual Property Office, Tim Moss, where Swaley has expressed an interest in developing an exciting agenda for intellectual property. The IP industry is an important part of the UK economy, and it could suffer deeply post-Brexit, as legal firms redomicile in the EU and the UK loses its place as the English-speaking gateway into Europe. Even the areas in which the UK has attempted to maintain close relations with the EU, such as the long-mooted Unified Patent Court, have been met with confusion and indecision. First, the UK ratified the agreements regulating to unitary patent and the Unified Patent Court, but has just recently said that it's now pulling out of them. This begs the question, why did it ratify the agreement in the first place? It seems that everyone is equally confused, and the reason they are confused is obvious, because the UK government does not seem to know what it wants, or even if these issues exist in the first place. According to a recent study, the intellectual property law firm, HDF, 31% of businesses still do not know how they will register trademarks after Brexit, and 33% said that Brexit will make brand protection harder for their businesses, and nearly half say that they will have to change their brand protection strategy. More than half of these businesses also believe that Brexit uncertainty is affecting their sales, brand, and wider businesses. Intellectual property is a key facet of the UK's economic prowess. A complete disregard for its for this could be catastrophic in efforts to maintain a strong country post-Brexit. But unless the government stops shifting the minister in charge every few months and then starts coming up with a set position, there's little response to be a reason to be optimistic about its future. And I know I do that shrug every time, but that's the only genuine response I have most these days. I have friends in Europe, and my genuine response is I just send the Elmo shrugging quote where he's just like that when they ask about Brexit. And this, you can see how unclear the UK government is, because it has not set out its negotiating position. And this is why businesses are suffering from Brexit uncertainty. Despite what other people say, and they try and shift the blame onto Remainers, that just isn't the case. It's the government's fault because they have refused to set out a clear negotiating path. And as far as I'm concerned, the guy who's just walked into the European Union has basically walked in with no idea of what he wants, and essentially I think it has been intentionally done by this government to sabotage the negotiations so that Boris Johnson and his cronies can walk away with a no-deal Brexit and then try and pin the blame on the EU, when in reality they're the ones who wanted a no-deal Brexit but know full well they would never be able to pass it through Parliament and want the economic damage to ensue so that their buddies, the disaster capitalists, can come in and start sweeping up British assets left, right and centre. And that, my friends, is Brexit. And it ain't going to help anyone who voted for it.